Mark. Well, our next guest is at the heart of two very big stories this week. He's a leading Brexit supporter and the architect of the flagship welfare reform, Universal Credit. So, welcome to you, Iain Duncan Smith. It feels like we should start off with Brexit. Big story, of course, as always. We understand, don't we, that Theresa May's latest kind of backstop offer to the EU would effectively keep the UK in a customs union. I mean, is that something you could support?
Well, not really, and it's very difficult to quite know what is going on at the moment. So if I just take a pace back, people voted to leave. They didn't vote to half leave. They didn't vote to half join. They voted to leave. It was a pretty clear decision, you know, take back control of our laws, our borders, and our money. And I think, therefore, you have to see everything through that little prism. How does it measure up? And I think what's very clear is we had agreed an implementation period, providing we had a deal. And that also hinged £39 billion to the EU if we got that deal. If we end up staying in the customs union, for that implementation period, we would de facto be in the customs union anyway. But the key question is, when does it end? And it has to end in a very specific way, because being in the customs union is not what the people voted for. And we wouldn't be able to do any trade deals, wouldn't be able to look at anything with the USA or with Japan, who's been talking about bringing us into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. All that would not happen. So it's very, very dodgy.
If there's no clear end date for this backstop plan, customs union plan, you would vote against a deal that included it?
Yeah, I think it's not just end date, by the way. It's a little bit more than that. It's not just having an end date. It's knowing that the UK government will be able to leave if it was to agree to stay in the customs union, which I, by the way, think should only be over the period of the implementation phase. I do not see any reason why longer. Then it should be not just end dated, but controlled by the UK. But the second bit is we're in this mess because the government keeps refusing to take on, head on, the issue of the backstop. It was a mistake in December last year. I told the Prime Minister, walk away from the table, do not sign this, it will box you in. And the problem is that the EU and Ireland insist that you have to have a hard border if there is no deal. It's complete rubbish. Even Barnier now admits it doesn't happen. I mean, we wrote a paper the other day, a group of us, to say basically that it's wholly feasible to have an open border at Dover as well as in Northern Ireland without border checks at all, under existing technologies and procedures. That's been accepted, by the way, by everybody.
So it's pretty clear that you're not happy with the kind of way that Theresa May is perhaps moving towards the EU. Do you support David Davis's call this morning for a kind of cabinet mutiny, if you like, to try and kill it off?
I share one thing in common with David Davis, which is we've both resigned from a cabinet when we weren't in agreement with it, and therefore I'm always of the view that when you get to the point where you no longer agree on a fundamental issue, then it's probably time that you found yourself on the back benches. But it's up to people to do that themselves.
So do you think we could see some resignations over this?
Well, it might. I am never a very good speculator, but I do say to anyone who's in Cabinet who has concerns about this, you have to make them very clear to the Prime Minister. And we mustn't have a little cabal outside the Cabinet running this. It has to be a Cabinet decision. And more importantly, I think the real question here is, we have a very strong set of cards to play. 39 billion and security are all on the table at the moment. And the EU, we know BMW and others are now beginning to moan. It's a very good speech made by an MEP called Herr Henkel in the European Parliament the other day. And I watched it, and he really went for Juncker and said, you messed up before the referendum, and you're about to mess up now. And he used a very interesting figure. He said, the departure of Britain isn't just, isn't bad for Britain. It's a disaster for the EU. He said it's the equivalent of 9 small or medium countries leaving the EU at once. We will all over here suffer. You have to have a proper deal with them. And so very simple message I say to the Prime Minister and others, look, it's great if you're going to be a bloody difficult woman over something. That's a real strength when you're on the right course. But when you're not on the right course, sometimes you need to take a pace back and say, is there a better way? And I think there is a better way to do this, which is to put the ball back in the EU's court and say, look, we have never accepted this backstop. This is a ludicrous political intervention. You now must agree with us. There will never be a hard border, with or without a deal, and then full Canada plus trade deal is on the table.
You talk about Theresa May there being a bloody difficult woman. I wonder if you're prepared to be a bloody difficult backbencher. There's been talk, hasn't there, about backbenchers being prepared to vote down the budget, for example, to effectively wage a campaign of insurrection to try and force Theresa May to change her direction?
I'm not in favour of a kind of insurrection. We have a government, we have a party to stay together. We have to get through this together and come out the other side together. Otherwise, for us, the big threat, much bigger than Brexit, is Jeremy Corbyn with a terrible plan to basically tax the hell out of the country. And
so would you back Theresa May then if there was a no confidence vote?
I don't want to see a leadership change. I want to see a leadership change her mind and go in a different direction, and to listen to people who say, look, nobody voted to stay in the customs union. We want to get through this and out the other end. People out there have decided, let's get on with it, let's deliver it, let's get out.
Now, I'm keen to talk to you about universal credit as well. Yeah. It's been in the news an awful lot recently, a lot of criticism. Now, when you first announced the policy 8 years ago, we can just have a look at what you said, which is, hopefully coming up, it's a proud duty to provide financial security to the most vulnerable members of our society, and this will not change. This is our contract with the most vulnerable.
Indeed.
Currently, do you think the Conservatives have broken that contract?
I don't yet. When I set universal credit, it was because I studied for some years the mess that the tax credit system had got into, housing benefit, all these different places people went to. Got confused. Quite often, single women would go into work, lose their jobs at 15 hours. After a while, they'd come out, take nearly 2 months to get their housing benefit back. And we know that with tax credits, many of us had people coming into our surgeries saying after a year of bad estimates, they ended up with massive debts on their hands. In fact, as tax credit recipients go over to UC, they've been carrying about £6 billion worth of tax credit debts with them, as well as the housing benefit debts. So any wonderful ideas that what this replaces was not damaging are mad. The very bad system we had before. So the purpose of universal credit was to make things simpler to understand so that people knew they made one claim, and more importantly, which is forgotten, they have a human person. They have a person who is their advisor they can go and see and talk to.
You see, those aims sound very noble.
Well, those are the things that are rolling out.
Some of the analysis is worrying. The Work and Pension Secretary admitting some people will be worse off. The Resolution Foundation saying 3 million people, families, will lose more than £2,000
So let me bring that into context.
Concern.
So the structure of what's rolling out is rolling out well. It's nearly out to all the job centres. And the advisors having a much better relationship, and there are tens of thousands of people that find this a better system. However, you're talking about the money. So when I launched this, we specifically set down an amount of money that would allow this to roll out correctly and have the levels of payments at the right level. In the 2015 spending review, a very significant amount of money was taken out of universal credit. I had big issues over that. There was another attempt to take more money out at around Christmas 2015, and for me that was the final straw. I then resigned. There were a number of other changes and cuts too, which I didn't agree with, including the disability one. My view is, and has been for some time, the government has a really, really transformative policy on its hands. You do not underfund it as it goes in, because if you do that, then what you do is lose the great benefit of it and then end up starving people of cash.
And potentially breaking that contract with the most vulnerable. Because, so I mean, if you just going back to, your promise to look after the most vulnerable, I mean, one of the things that people are saying now is that some of the people who could be about to lose out are those who are the most vulnerable. Lone parents, for example. I mean, you're a father, you know how difficult it is to bring up a child. These are people in work, often.
Couldn't agree with you more.
People trying to do the right thing.
Which is why, for the last 2.5 years, I've proposed constantly that we put the money that was taken out, it was nearly £5 billion, was taken out, back in.
So £5 billion?
Well, the government has actually been quite good. They put about £2 billion back in. What's left is about between £2 and £3 billion, I would think.
And you want that addressed in the budget, do you?
Well, I think it's wholly feasible, and you don't have to add any new spending. They have a plan at the moment to raise the tax thresholds, which is a manifesto commitment. But the trouble is we've raised them so high now that most of the poorest don't get affected by another rise in tax thresholds. About 20% would get any benefit from this because so many are out of tax. Whereas with universal credit, if you put the money that was there into the allowances, which is like a tax threshold for very poor people, then in actual fact what you do is nearly 80% of your money goes straight to the poorest 4 deciles. Now, I think it's a no-brainer. If you take that money, you will deliver on what I said, and at the same time, you will really improve the lifestyles of people in the poorest circumstances. That's what universal credit was designed to do. It's why I brought it in. It is now ready to do that. We just need to grab this bull by the horns and say, this money should go right to the poorest. I'm
just having a look. I know you're not on Twitter, possibly very sensible, but just in the break, just having a look at some of the reaction that I can see to the interview. for example, somebody talking about Iain Duncan Smith, who shoulders no responsibility for the complete screw-up of universal credit. Is it hurtful, some of... Because you clearly
well, a lot of those will be people who have a very vested interest in selling that stuff.
Of course, but is it hurtful that for some people you are the face of all the problems with universal credit and how some people would view it as the kind of nasty party, if you like?
Yeah, but it's not. I mean, the point is that you can believe that if you want. That's, sometimes people get ridiculously politicized. I mean, momentum troll everybody at the moment, so there's just no way out of that. My point, however, though, is this benefit was deliberately set to be rolled out as a test and learn process. When tax credits were rolled out, they were rolled out in one go. Nearly 750,000 people didn't get their money at all and have never received their money.
So it's the implementation.
So the implementation was deliberately careful and slow. We looked at this. We did it like this. So when you meet an issue or problem, you check whether it's an operational problem or a technical problem, then you make the adjustments accordingly. That's exactly what's been going on. Last Christmas, they made some adjustments. I was recommending those as well. Changes to the way in which people coming off housing benefit coming on could continue to keep their housing benefit. So they invested another $1 billion, and that was exactly the point that I'm making. So universal credit is a better benefit. What's very rarely happens is people don't hear from the tens of thousands of people who actually find this a much better benefit. They're allowed to take very low hours work if necessary. They've got caring responsibilities. So getting it right is important. I'm not shirking any responsibility. I resigned back in 2016 because I did not agree with the government's position over taking the money out of this and a couple of other areas as well.
Do you take any responsibility for what some would see as the design flaws in universal credit? Things like, for example, people having to wait 5 weeks for a payment. I mean, if you're on a breadline, then no surprise is it that people are falling behind on rent payments, that they're having to rely on food banks, that they have to wait for that amount of time.
Let's be very careful, though. Benefits have always been paid in arrears. There's some kind of mystery that somehow previous benefits were paid in advance. They've never been paid in advance. They're paid in arrears, and they were then paid 2 weeks in arrears. The plan for universal credit was a month in arrears for a very good reason.
There's quite a big difference, though, isn't there, between 2 weeks and a month?
Yeah, but the vast majority of jobs actually pay a month in arrears. If you aren't capable of coping with that, then you're going to go into a job and crash out quite quickly. So there's another element that runs alongside universal credit, which hasn't been completely rolled out. It's called universal support. So the idea with universal credit doesn't just pay a benefit. If you identify somebody who has a problem, debt problems, etc., they're moved to universal support, working with the local authorities, the charities, and all those other bodies in the local area. They're then put on to debt counselling, or if they have drugs problems, they're meant to be moved over into rehabilitation. The point about universal credit, it will identify that minority of people who have real problems, who will not be able to move into work with those problems, and then try and resolve them. That's the real design of UC. It's not completely rolled out in that sense. We need to put more effort onto universal support, which is the parallel bit beside it, which allows those advisors to be able to say, right, this individual now needs to get into some kind of remedial help before we can get them back into work.
Quick thought, what do you make of Labour's position? It feels as if it's perhaps slightly shifting. John McDonnell saying that they wanted to get rid of it. Shami Chakrabarti was slightly more circumspect, perhaps.
Yes, it's all very well to attack, but you're quite right. Labour at the moment are, I think, in a bit of a mess because at first they said, well, before Corbyn came in, they were supportive and they wanted to get changes made. Then suddenly it was sweep it all away, we'll go back to another system, which, frankly, if anybody thinks tax credits or housing benefits were in any way fair, then they really need to have their brains examined. So now they seem, as you said in that interview, to say, well, if the government puts the money in, which is what I want, then we will continue to look at the mechanisms. But there's one area where they're in a real mess over, and this is the problem. There's always been agreement on both sides of the House that if people don't do what they've been asked to do while they receive benefits, then they would stand to lose some of those benefits for a period of time. Labour has said that will never happen. That means someone never turning up to an interview, never bothering to do anything with regards to taking the job, or anything they've been asked to do specific to receiving that benefit. Taxpayers will end up paying a huge amount more money.
Finally, who is to blame? You've admitted that there are issues with universal credit. A lot of very vulnerable people could be worse off. Who's to blame? Is it George Osborne? Is it Theresa May? Is it Asa McVeigh?
No, I think the key thing is that the structure works. You need to put the money in. I think this government is listening. I think the Chancellor is listening. And I'm asking him to do that. If we do that and get the money back to where it should be, the reality is that nobody should lose at all.
And if you don't?
Well, if we don't, I'm going to continue to badger away because I think it's the right thing to do. And the one thing I've always said, and Theresa May stood on the steps of Downing Street and said, I want to look after those who are just managing. Universal credit is the single best instrument to get to those who are just managing. It's better than the tax system. It's better than charitable giveaways. It gets the money to that bottom 4 deciles in a way that no other system does.
Iain Duncan Smith, thank you very much.